So I am delighted and honoured to be hosting a conversation with Shelley Bamford today on a topic that I can only see as growing more and more relevant as time goes on. And we're going to have a really open and honest discussion about Shelley's role and what she does. Shelley is an independent domestic abuse consultant. She's worked in this field for over 20 years, and her particular expertise is working with the male perpetrators of domestic abuse. Now, it's a topic that's been around for a long, long time, and I'm sad to say, we need to talk more about it. It needs to be something that probably raised more in the open, in the open as time goes on. What's going on and the tragic circumstances surrounding, last week and this weekend has probably made this more relevant. And as a man, I think it's important that we talk about it, but also that we listen as well. So, Shelley, thank you very much for joining me. Pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Shelley, you've had a very, very interesting career. But if I can say that, you've worked in what I can only say is male-dominated sectors, and what you've done, and it's kind of led you to the path you're doing. Can you tell me a little bit of what you've done in your background, in your past, your history?
Yeah, so I was in the army for 22 years. The first 10 years of that, I was a Royal Military Policewoman, and for the latter 12 years of that, an army welfare worker. So in both of those roles, I became involved first in 2001. Actually, I was asked by the military police at the time to undertake a role as the domestic abuse liaison officer, as was then. It wasn't a role I actually wanted to undertake at the time, I have to say, but 20 years later, here I am. And then in the Army Welfare Service, once I transferred there, is the Army's pastoral role, if you like, but equally kind of the Army's, it takes on all the safeguarding mandated cases, a little bit of life coaching, a little bit of sort of wellness and that kind of thing as well. And by the time I left, I was the military lead for the Army in domestic abuse. That was sort of an international role for me as well, for supporting units that were overseas and personnel overseas. And I wrote and implemented the very first MOD perpetrator program for us to work with service perpetrators of domestic abuse. Alongside that, I moonlighted, if you like, for a period of 20 years as a volunteer for two different community-based charities in Wiltshire and in Hampshire on perpetrator programs as a facilitator of the groups.
Wow, that's quite a deep insight into what you've done, and it's you must have seen so much and heard so much and been involved. And sorry, I'm finding it quite hard because it's just like you're so open about it. But what a journey that is to have. So I suppose for me, and I think anybody listening here, is that I make an assumption of what domestic abuse is, and I think of what would I look for to what somebody who's been domestically abused, and then I think to myself, I've actually no idea. I'm looking at physical signs and what's going on in the back, what goes on in the background. But tell me, what are the signs then? What should people be looking for?
So I think you were right earlier when you said that this conversation today, I think, is quite timely. I think at the moment, employers in particular are taking mental health and mental well-being much more seriously, and this really ties in with that. And it's really not uncommon to hear someone say that very often domestic abuse is seen as being a physical crime, or potentially not being quite as serious if there are no physical injuries. So the government definition of domestic abuse puts domestic abuse in a lot of different categories. So we have psychological, we have sexual, we have economic, physical, emotional, and verbal abuse as well. So there are lots of different categories. My experience of working with both victims and perpetrators of domestic abuse is that very often abuse in one household will be an overlap of those different categories. Wherever abuse is taking place, whether that is physical, and you would predominantly categorize that as physical, there is always psychological abuse. So some examples really of kind of, so economic abuse can be about, it's always about power and control. I think, first of all, let me just kind of say that, you know, abuse is not about, I lost my temper, somebody pressed my buttons and I couldn't control myself. It's not about that. It's about power and control over another person. And very often, and it's patterned behavior as well. It's not one-off incidents, you know, but perpetrators use patterned behaviors both within one relationship and across relationships. So certainly, if you're looking at things like economic abuse, we might be looking at, and sort of here today talking about, you know, employment, for example. It might be stopping a partner going out to work so that they don't have access to funding. It's much more difficult to leave an abusive partner if you haven't got access to funds. I worked for a period with Women's Aid just after leaving the army, and it really opened my eyes to some of the issues we perhaps don't have quite so much in the forces always, about the fact that up until recently, that you can now catch a train to get to a refuge. But if you're going to a refuge that's way out of your county, you couldn't get, there are no funds to get you there unless you have them yourself. So, you know, it's things like that really. But it could also be limiting the funds that a spouse has, so that the children perhaps are walking around with holes in their shoes, or the nutrition in the home isn't good enough, or bills aren't being paid. You know, there's a lot of different kind of knock-on effects.
So broad. It's really, really broad. And it's, I suppose, as an employer, you know, I'm talking about, you know, some of the things you've just mentioned there are just ringing in my head, because I'm doing a lot of work with labour exploitation and human trafficking, but it just sounds like it's not like they're disconnected. You know, there's similar.
No.
What you mentioned there is control, financial control, emotional control, and that's hitting it really hard. If I'm an employer, if you're an employer, then you know, I've quite ignorant now. You know, I feel really, really silly, but you know, what are the signs then? What should be? How do you recognise these signs? What should you be looking for as an employer in a workplace? Supervisors, managers, whoever it may be.
So first of all, I think it's important for me to contextualise this for you. So as an employer, it's worth knowing that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men will have some experience of domestic abuse across their lifetime. In England and Wales, 2 women per week are killed by an intimate partner or ex-partner, and that has been exacerbated over lockdown. And one man per month will be killed under the same circumstances by an intimate or ex-partner. So that's really high levels we're talking about here of people that are touched by domestic abuse in their life. As an employer, I think things to look for really, it's much more difficult, isn't it, in today's climate, because very often we're like we are today, we're sat behind a computer. So that, you know, I will come to some things you can do, like perhaps sort of later on in the conversation, but it's about knowing your employees for a start. And this goes for not just the employer's responsibility, it's everybody's responsibility. You know, sometimes the boss or the CEO or the manager doesn't know the person on the desk, but you do. You know the people working next to you. So you might be looking at changes of behaviour. You know, some really key signs can be absenteeism is a really key sign of that domestic abuse might be taking place. 54% of employers in England and Wales will tell you that productivity is often lowered when they are aware of domestic abuse, and there's a 56% increase in absenteeism. So that's a big one. Being slightly obsessional potentially about leaving on time and routines, maybe absolutely taking a lunch break at an exact time, increased telephone calls, text messages, kind of checking the phone. They're all kind of productivity things to look for. But characteristics, are there changes in somebody's demeanour? Have they become more distracted than usual? Are they appearing to be quite stressed, anxious, upset? Are they disproportionately worried about their children being at home alone? Are they wearing clothing maybe that doesn't fit the weather? You know, domestic abuse victims, if they're covering bruises, might wear a lot more makeup. They might be covering up their arms or sort of the chest area. You know, for those that are at work, perpetrators are quite clever. They would probably not be punching somebody to give visible signs on the face, but you might be looking at people wearing cardigans when it's boiling hot, kind of things like, stuff like that, really. And so we look at the obvious things like bruises, but why can somebody not be flexible? Why can't they stay to help on a big project for overtime tomorrow? And of course there are real excuses for that. People might have childcare reasons, doctor's appointments, etc. But equally, if you're putting a picture together, and I always say to people, your intuition is your biggest tool. If you think something isn't quite right, it probably isn't.
And this is ringing with me because with regards to labour exploitation and spotting the signs in work, there's a number of discussions I've had, and there's a chap called Shane Tyler who works for a company called Fresca Group, and he's coined this phrase about the absence of, we're looking for the absence of normal, but it's actually it's picking up on worker welfare. And worker welfare, that, Shelley, that's just absolutely spot on, because it's everybody's duty, isn't it? And this is the conversations that we would be having. Yes, we're talking behind screens just now, right? But in the workplace where we are talking to people on a daily basis, asking them what they got up to the weekend and how did you spend your paycheck, or did you buy that new present, or whatever it was that looking at cars or whatever it may be. And there is a little bit of a societal change that I think is we need to look after each other. We need to look after each other as human beings, and that starts in the people. Of course, it's your family first of all, but you're in work and you spend a lot of time in work. And when we are in the work, we should be asking how people are. We should genuinely be interested, and we need to kind of get back into that, because I don't think it's something that we can't achieve. But tell me if I'm wrong here, Shelley. That sounds like it was like the welfare of humans is important.
I mean, absolutely, 100%. I mean, your human resources are your biggest and your most important and your most valuable resource in any business, aren't they?
Yeah.
And having worked for 12 years, in welfare, where that is what we would do, and in the army. And I think this is the same for every business. My role was about productivity. The job that I did was about keeping boots on the ground. It was about keeping units operational. But actually, if that meant somebody needed to take a short period of time out of the workplace, or we needed to change their working hours to enable them to manage something, to achieve a work-life balance, to manage something else that was going on. So for a short-term pain, if you like, for a long-term gain. And my role, I was very, very lucky, both in the volunteer role and my day job in the army, is that we had professional supervision regularly, where we would have these discussions, both informally and formally, but we would have a formal safe space to do that. And I think any organisation can implement that. As a line manager, you should be able to give your employees 20 minutes of safe, protected time just to see how they are.
And that's kind of, I suppose, as a specialist in this area, then, Shelley, would you, what should can you support that with policies and other documentation, I suppose, or other formalities, or is it just about giving people time and space, or how do you look at that?
I think giving people time and space is really important, and I think that if you haven't undergone the kind of training that is required to deliver the professional supervision in that way, just giving 20 minutes, asking people open questions. How can I best support you? What's your biggest challenge right now? What's going on for you? Just 20 minutes of that. I think can do the world of good, and it can really open doors. I had a really very wise boss once who said to me, it's all very well saying I've got an open door policy, if I never walk out of that door. I expect people to walk in, I need to walk out. But anybody who's watching this can Google professional supervision, and what we would work to would be actual theoretical models as well. And that goes the counselling world and social work, and we work to a social work model in the Army Welfare Service will have that provision. But like I say, if you don't have that provision and you're not able to get that training, just that conversation as a good line manager, I think it can, and certainly where domestic abuse is an issue, it can take time for people to build trust. It's unlikely someone's going to disclose to you straight away. In the last 12 months, there's been less than one disclosure per organisation in the UK. in the last 12 months, and that's worrying because that means that people don't feel they can disclose. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, that's interesting. And tell me then, so you know, as we come to a close here, Shelley, what's if you first of all, two things. If you are in a workplace and some of the things we've discussed, then you maybe think, right, okay, I suspect that one of my colleagues may be a victim of in these circumstances. What should that person do? How can they support them? What can they do?
I think there's some key things for an organisation to do. What I would like to draw attention to actually is Public Health England have a fantastic toolkit, and the document that they've produced has everything that any employer could possibly want to know to help you to get yourself started with this, really. So I would say there are several things. First of all, have a no tolerance policy. In that policy, be very explicit. Who are you targeting? Because there are different challenges for different groups. So you need to be explicit if your policy includes the LGBT community, if it includes people that are men and women, if it includes people from different ethnic backgrounds, because what we do know, in particular for the LGBT community, is that if a policy doesn't explicitly state that it's inclusive of them, they assume sometimes that it's not. So there are different challenges. Be collaborative with the person that is making the disclosure. First of all, believe them, be collaborative. Make sure you include them in any decisions that are made about, and ultimately what it's about is prioritising safety. So can you help them by changing their working hours or giving flexibility to working hours? I had a lady that I was supporting a few years ago who we were very, very concerned about, and her employer, in fact, provided a space in the building where, as a support worker, for an hour a week, I could go and meet with her to offer that private support that her partner would never know about.
Okay.
If the perpetrator works for the same organisation, because 75% of perpetrators use workplace resources to abuse, can we divert their emails, their phones, so they can't get in touch with the victim in the same organisation? Can we limit calendars so people can see who's where, that kind of thing? How does the victim want you to respond to the perpetrator? Should the perpetrator contact the building or, turn up at the building? Have they got safe routes home? And most importantly, if you're not an expert in dealing with domestic abuse, know in your area who are the professionals, who could I signpost this person to be able to offer that support, that professional specialist support.
Wow, there's some really, really key points, and I think that you mentioned about the workplace resources, just very, very interesting. So finally, then, Shelley, before we close, is that if you are now you've listened to this or watched this and you think, well, actually, I'm in trouble here. I'm in a relationship that isn't right, and this isn't. I need to do something about it. What should they do?
Okay, so if you're watching this and you're in that situation, first thing I would say to always be aware of is clear your phone history of what you've watched and maybe what you've Googled. And the first step that would be the most helpful, I think, is to contact the National Domestic Abuse Helpline. And you can Google that number very, very easily. And the reason for that is because they have quite a coordinated, first of all, they can offer 24-hour support to anybody calling them. They were able to do that. Equally, what is important to know is that they will never put you in danger. So even if you ask for a call back, they will ask questions to ascertain whether or not the perpetrator is present. They will make sure they will prioritise your safety. What they can do is help you establish, first of all, if you need immediate refuge or police support, they can help organise that. But equally, if you're not quite at the place where you're ready to leave, they will be able to identify for you what your local support service is. Women's Aid works generally in most areas within the UK, so they'll be able to tap you into that. Women's Aid unfortunately don't support male victims of domestic abuse, so there are other agencies for men such as Mankind, but they will be able to help put those things in place and refer you on to somebody who can give you that sort of immediate local support.
Okay, so following on from this, we'll put some information on about those links and those contacts.
Yeah.
Bamford, independent domestic abuse consultant. Thank you very much. Very interesting, very topical, and a very alarming conversation. But I'm very glad that I've had it with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.